thank you for coming to the symposium today. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and Jack, it's a pleasure to meet you finally. I wanted to talk today with you about the relationship of journalism to machine learning, AI, and technology more generally, and how journalists can approach the subject to be clearer, and how journalists should be critical of the subject when we're told things by tech vendors, by governments, by regulators, policymakers about the capacity and capabilities of these systems. So I wanted to start with success stories because it's easy to talk about how this goes wrong. But do any of you have favorite examples of ways in which um, uh, journalists have successfully bridged the gap between the policy questions, the technical questions, and the everyday issues that people face when they encounter these automated systems, these statistical inference systems? And when you speak for the first time, please feel free to introduce yourself and say a few words about who you are and what you do.
I'm Tim Maughan. I'm a journalist and writer and novelist, and a mixture of all those things. Whatever pays the rent this week, it feels like a lot of the time. I did one example I think that I use a lot for just introducing these concepts to people who aren't familiar with them is and I can't remember who wrote it up, which is really bad of me. But it was a really good explanation of the Amazon recruitment algorithm story. I think it was in Gizmodo or Vox, one of these places, and it's just the perfect, because these concepts they're increasingly hard for people to understand, I think, and it's just a really beautiful little simple write-up of what happened to Amazon. If you don't know the story, Amazon had a lot of concerns that they weren't hiring enough women. They assumed that the recruitment process was sexist in some way. So they decided the best way to fix it was to get an algorithm to do it, because algorithms lack bias. So they got this algorithm, they ran this algorithm on recruitment for like a year, ended up they were still recruiting. In fact, they were recruiting more men than they were before they ran the algorithm. Of course, what the result was, the reason this was happening was because they were feeding the algorithm with the resumes of people they'd already recruited. So they were basically teaching the algorithm to copy the same sexist recruitment policies that the human recruitment had. And it's one of those stories that when I explain it to people, I use it in my work, or talk to people when I'm talking to students and people about this stuff. It's like, oh, it's like that one that breaks the mythology around this stuff. And I think as journalists, we need to be looking for more examples of that, of those kind of simple introductory stories. Where it goes from there, I don't know. Where we go into more complicated conversations, I'm not sure. And I think we're all just still feeling that out to a certain amount of time. It's one of those things. Journalism, I think, especially American journalism, has had a problem historically with talking about power and power relationships. And what we're really talking about a lot of these conversations is our power relationships, as much as we're talking about technology. And I think that's something that we probably need to center in these discussions as well.
Jack, April, do either of you have? Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna jump in, but for me, it's two iconic stories by Julia Agwin. One from 2016 about the redictivism algorithm that's used by the criminal justice system called Compass, that really put into perspective not only that algorithms are used in really just kind of, I don't want to say mundane, but in so many ways that we don't even realize, right? Like by the legal system, by the court system, to determine, sentencing, and how those algorithms are built by companies that are making a series of decisions, including the data that they put into them, and then how those outputs actually affect people in very, very concrete and unjust ways, right? That then perpetuate the inequities that we already experience socially. And then the other one, I believe, was a year later by Julia Agwin as well, for ProPublica as well, before she started the markup, about Facebook's internal algorithm in terms of deciding what gets taken down and what stays on Facebook. And I say algorithm, I'm using that loosely because it was actually an internal company policy that determined, whether or not what counted as hate speech and what didn't count as hate speech. But that policy was baked into a lot of the automated decision tools, or at least when something was flagged as potentially hate speech, then it would go to a person. And one thing I really liked about that story is, first of all, it showed kind of that when you try to bake in social justice issues into rule books, into policies, right, where you just have to say like 1 + 1 must equal 2, that's just not the way life pans out, right? And so I believe in this one, it worked out so that using Facebook's particular code or rules, if you were taking down content about white men, would be considered hate speech, but not against Black children, because age wasn't considered to be something that denoted a category of discrimination. But I really like that, because then again, it shows these algorithms, these kind of black box systems that determine how we interact with each other, how we share information, how we know what's going on in the world and how to get there, whether or not how a sentence is determined in the judicial system. These are made by people who are deciding these rules and are writing these programs. And there's a lot of points of decision and human intervention and crafting that goes into this, that we often just kind of, or not we often, but that companies can just kind of shuffle under the rug or put into the code or say it's an algorithm, and then that kind of obfuscates where the responsibility comes in. So I would say Julia Agwin's reporting in the last 5 years has really been tremendous in this space.
I'd certainly second that. April, would you introduce yourself briefly as well?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I'm tech reporter at investigative reporter at NBC News. And before that, I actually worked at a place where Cory, I believe, is still working, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I worked in technology policy for many years at various nonprofits prior to becoming a journalist.
Great. And Jack, did you have anything you wanted to add? And could you introduce yourself too?
Sure. So I actually was going to name 3 articles from ProPublica, and there's overlap in one of them from what April just mentioned. So that it's a bit of a shock. I thought there might be 2 of the pieces were going to be the same. But I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Tech Inquiry. I used to be a researcher at Google, and before that was an applied math professor, and try to focus on raising the voices of concerned tech workers and in particular civil society on issues like this. So I really love the theme of this this call. But in terms of responding to the question, there was another really impactful piece, again by Julia, that was on how Facebook was able to do the equivalent of like digital redlining through something called their lookalike audiences tool. And the reason I remember that standing out to me is when I was at Google, I was actually part of a team that built Google's analog of essentially the same tool. And I remember us having some kind of internal discussions of, is this okay? Like, aren't there privacy issues with, effectively if an advertiser could say, here's a group of people we like, can you give us more people just like that? The way I've come to think of that, I would use the term like choose your own discrimination for how that effectively functions. And the math can be a bit interesting as to how you think about defining the similarity of 2 different groups. But anyway, I would say that was a very impactful piece, especially if you measure it from the fact that there was a lawsuit that was started afterwards. And one could say something similar about the ProPublica piece on TurboTax explicitly finding ways to avoid letting users that qualified for the free version of the tax software to use it. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a technical piece, but I think it's one that's extremely impactful. And then the third I was going to mention was the coded bias piece that was on Compass and its parent company, Northpoint, which weirdly enough, I went down the rabbit hole of them getting merged with 2 other companies about 6 months later. And they're now part of, well, since 2011, they've been part of this company called Constellation Software, if I remember correctly. But they're a good example of how hard it is to track who even owns companies in some cases. And there seems to be correlation with some of the shadiest companies being the hardest to track. And another example of that I would cite is blue coat systems, which still to some degree exists. And it's actually hard to pin down which pieces of it are in Accenture and which parts are in Broadcom. But
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, you see the same from the NSO group, where their true ownership is quite obfuscated, and there's a Canadian billionaire who has some interest in it who threatened to sue me for writing about it. So definitely there's that kind of obfuscation is alive and well, and rarely a sign that people are really doing something great and just don't want to ruin the surprise for you, and so they're keeping it a secret. I wanted to mention a person who actually does this in reverse, someone who uses statistics and statistical extrapolation and modeling to explain hidden phenomena and also to debunk the bad use of statistics. And that's a guy named Patrick Ball, who runs a nonprofit called the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And HRDAG got its start using statistics to flesh out the full scope of war atrocities for international human rights tribunals, criminal cases in The Hague, truth and reconciliation, and so on. And there would be fragmentary evidence about things like extrajudicial killings, tortures, punitive rapes, and so on. And Patrick and his team would use statistical methods to extrapolate the scope of hidden information, right? How many bodies we didn't count. And these were really effective in Serbia, South Africa, East Timor, in the Ruiz Monte, Guatemala trial, and so on. And, you know, Patrick's work is to frame this in terms that judges and juries can understand. And so really it's a very lay audience, and it's not just a lay audience, it's a lay audience, especially when we talk about judges who are accustomed to never having to work hard to figure stuff out, right? You know, there's that old saw like, oh, this technology is so easy, my mom can use it. Like it's not just, you know, sexist and horrible, but it fundamentally misunderstands the relationship of being a mom using technology, which is that no one ever asks you what you need. No one ever designs anything that you can possibly use. And all of your technology use involves contorting yourself and finding ways around the blind spots of the designers. They're, you know, the Delta Force ninjas of technology adaptation. You know, the people who have it easy is your boss, right? Technology is so easy your boss can use it. Is technology that, you know, like your boss can call you from the lobby of the Comfort Inn and say like, I don't care about your firewall rules. As soon as that kid is done playing Tetris on the iMac, I want to download my PowerPoint slides for today. And you just got to make it happen, right? So, you know, judges are like this. Judges are the bosses of bosses. And Patrick's work has been historically very good at taking these impatient people who are accustomed to discarding information that they find difficult to understand and actually leading them through some very abstract and complex statistical pictures. And he has then used that to critique bad statistical methods, especially statistical methods in the machine learning statistical inference and classifiers. And one of the pieces of work that he did that I found really powerful was his critique of the Oakland, or rather of PredPol, which is the predictive policing system. And he used Oakland to do it. Oakland's not a PredPol city as far as we know. But what Oakland is a city that had been part of the NIH National Survey of Drug Use. And so the NIH National Survey of Drug Use is a triennial survey that tells you with more precision than any other instrument we know about where drugs are being used, and therefore to a first approximation where drug crimes are being committed. He also had the Oakland Police Department's data about where they found drug crimes the year before. And he said, based on the drug crime data from the year before the survey was taken, where PredPol should the police look for drug crime? And it produces a heat map showing you where it predicts the drug crime is going to occur in Oakland. And it's, you know, these bright red circles over very brown neighborhoods. And when you then overlay that with the NIH map of where actual drug crime took place, the entire city is pink, except for that bit near Berkeley where it's bright red, right? So white students, affluent white students, smoke a lot of weed. Everybody else takes it or doesn't take it, takes it or leaves it. And it was such a powerful exemplar. And I had a chance to field trial it. I was out on a book tour and I did a 3-day stop in Portland and in Washington State, just across the river, and with the library. and the library brought me around to a bunch of different places. And one of the places I went was the juvie detention hall. And I talked to a bunch of incarcerated kids. And I've talked to incarcerated kids before, usually when I was touring a young adult novel like Little Brother, and I talked to them about the themes in it. But, you know, Little Brother is a book from 2008, and this was last year, and I didn't want to tell them about a decade-old book that they were 6 years old when I published it or whatever. And so I told them about Patrick's work. I took them through a whole package of understanding bias and statistics. And these incarcerated kids absolutely 100% got it. Right. And, you know, it was, they had the advantage of having the dubious advantage of having direct lived experience of bias in policing methods. So they could understand that, but they also absolutely understood how statistical models that were fed with biased data would produce biased conclusions. And it really struck home for them, so much so that I've been working, not lately because it's the pandemic disrupted it, but I've been working on a curriculum I've been calling Street Fighting Math for Incarcerated Teens. That's about critical statistical concepts for kids in the justice system. April, I think it was you who touched on the human dimension of the modeling. And, you know, one of the things that we see whenever statistical methods are deployed is that it's hard to do math on qualitative elements. And so oftentimes when we ask people to compute problems with strong qualitative components, they're just like, well, I can probably discard those, right? I could just incinerate all the questions about what people are experiencing and just work on the quantitative parts, where they are and how long they're doing it for. And this is how you get contact tracing apps that can tell you that you were next to someone for 5 minutes, but not whether you were in 2 adjacent sealed cars or at an eyeball licking party. And I wonder if this is a motif that we can pick up here, where journalism can augment statistical understandings of events, where journalism is often about the thick description, the qualitative experience. And if you have any thoughts, any of the three of you, on how the introduction of qualitative, difficult to compute, maybe anthropological elements can inform these statistical, somewhat sociological models and discussions.
Sure. So I mean, my job is to talk to people. I mean, it's one of my jobs, and and that means talking to people who are on every end of whatever the question is that that we're looking into. So if we're talking about a social media platform that is taking down like YouTube, for example, or Facebook, that has very readily and quickly taken down a lot of human rights videos and pages of people in Arabic that are documenting human rights abuses, because they have such a heavy-handed algorithm when it comes to, say, removing terrorist-related content right off the platform. So within that, they also take down, kind of in the algorithmic dragnet of their software, take down other videos too, because the software just isn't as good at detecting speech or problematic kind of like terrorist-related content in Arabic as it is in English, let's say. And so, you know, we've seen stories reported on that. My colleague Olivia Salon has reported on that for NBC News. And in that, you know, you talk to the people who've had their stuff taken down. In fact, they might even be the ones that told you that this is a problem, right? So often we don't even find out that there is a problem with the software that's being applied until people who are harmed by it come forward and decide to like describe their experiences. So often when it comes to even on surface, like you know, unearthing and surfacing these stories, it comes from the people who have experienced the contradiction, right? And then from there, we also want to talk to, in terms of the qualitative experiences here, that, you know, that perhaps, you know, if we just dig into the algorithm, we're not going to get, or that the algorithm, you know, I know this isn't exactly what you were referring to, Cory, but that the algorithm didn't compute for. We find that the algorithm didn't work because we talked to people who it didn't work for. And then, you know, on the other side, we also talked to the people who wrote the algorithm. So increasingly, tech journalists, including myself, are talking to workers, right? People who realize that they've built something that is used in a way that they didn't expect it to be used that way, or they didn't expect it to be shaped that way, or maybe they were pushing back against it in the process of developing it. And so increasingly we're starting to look at these tech stories, and of which, by the way, is like every story because of the centrality of technology to everything. You know, while we were talking about what stories stick out as kind of black box algorithm stories, another one I forgot to mention would be the Volkswagen emission scandal, right? That's an environmental justice story. That's a story of evading regulation, very important carbon regulations. That was software that was written to evade that, right? And so, you know, we're not just, at least from the journalism perspective, yes, we have to go back and if we even get access to the code, go back and figure out how it went wrong. But often we even access the story in the first place because we talk to people who it went wrong for, or we talk to workers who realized it went wrong and decided that they don't want to be a part of building something like this, and they want more people to know about it. So the qualitative thing is really, you know, it's people talking to people, and that's how we find out about this.
So I have a lot of thoughts, but Tim, do you want to jump in so I don't?
No, not massively. I mean, I just agree with April. I mean, we don't know these things have gone wrong until people tell us, right? And I think there's the added complication as well that people don't know things have gone wrong themselves. You don't always know when you're being mishandled or prejudiced against by algorithmic stuff. I always think of the story of a lot of research that was done into Uber a few years ago, especially kind of counting. There was this idea that Uber was popular among non-white users because it meant that they weren't facing racism from cab drivers, right? You know, my black friends who would use Uber in New York because they couldn't get a cab to stop for them. And then the research came out like a year later, was actually Uber drivers are just as racist. You just don't see it because you don't physically see the cab driving past you. But if you had a profile picture or a name that suggested some ethnicity, then you would wait longer for a ride than white users, right? So there's this kind of, it's like, how do we find these problems a lot of the time? And yeah, certainly qualitative approaches, qualitative research, and good old fashioned like reporting is the answer a lot of the time.
One thing on this though, I'm sorry to jump in again, but Cory, you mentioned part of the work that you're doing now, which sounds so fascinating, is that you're what I drew from that in terms of your work with incarcerated youth, and it's really touching. I went to juvie twice before I was 18, so it's really great to hear about this. But one of the things with it is that people can and do understand complex things, right? Like this stuff
Sure.
is not so complicated that people can't understand it. And often people who are on the receiving end of a bad algorithm, right, know that, right? And
Yeah.
they can articulate that. Should we take the time to talk to them? And so like really, this stuff is, I mean, it's complicated. Sure, I can't write an algorithm, but I understand it, you know, and I can, and other people can too. And so really stop thinking if we can stop, and I think we have largely, so I don't mean this as any indictment, but stop thinking about these things as so complicated that people don't understand what's happening to them. It's more that people don't have control over what's happening to them, but they might very well understand it. And I really appreciated that in terms of what you said.
Thank
And
you.
it comes back
Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
No, it did come back to exactly what you were saying earlier, April, about how that the algorithmic bias and the policy have become fused in these companies. And it's always used as an excuse, right? So we don't understand the algorithm. I remember being at the first AA Now event in New York, like 4 or 5 years ago, I guess it was now. And we were having discussion about legal responsibility for algorithmic decisions. And a guy who was an algorithm developer from, I can't remember, it was one of the big tech companies, I won't say who I think it was, stood up and he was shaking. He was so visibly upset by the idea that we would try and hold him responsible. Because he was like, well, I don't understand what's happening. You can't hold me responsible for it. And it's a power shift. It's a power game. I don't doubt this guy. I don't doubt him. But the idea that this should somehow be an excuse for power abuses is terrifying.
One thing I've learned writing young adult novels is, and speaking to kids for a long time now, is that kids can be first-rate reasoners, just like adults can be, but aren't necessarily first-rate reasoners. But what they lack is context. And that's why you see kids who become prodigies in fields that don't require a lot of context. There are kids who are chess virtuosos and math virtuosos, but there's no Doogie Howser of history, right? Because like, if you're 17 years old, you haven't been alive long enough to read the books. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that there is always a place for laying out a case for someone who has the reasoning capacity to reason through the issues. Jack, I'm sorry, you've been trying to get in there, but I wanted to say my math thing before the mathematician spoke.
Oh, no, I mean, so to some degree, I was going to say that there's kind of two directions we could have taken this conversation. One is what was just being discussed, which is, we think of almost like the defensive side of algorithms, where someone, maybe the state, is employing a statistical model, and you need the ability to defend yourself, in which case I think that the work you're mentioning, Cory, is extremely important for that. The other side is how we choose to present our own arguments. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about how when companies build statistical models, the actual labor of the work, for the most part, is, for example, the labeling or the data set generation. And I think the same thing is true in statistics in general. So I think, statistics is one way to summarize a data set, but another way to help share a data set with people is through curation. And arguably, to get good statistics in the first place, you had to curate it before you can even run your statistics on it. Because, for example, whether it's lobbying records, federal contracting, political contributions, et cetera, these data sets don't come in a way where you can easily even do statistics. I mean, you can, but you're going to get wrong answers. For example, maybe a politician's name is spelled 100 different ways, or the name of the organization changed, or they were bought, they were sold, they were split, et cetera. So these types of tasks, I think, are highly underappreciated in the curation context. And if, so even as someone who would formerly identify as a mathematician, I think there's a lot more value in sharing the ability for others to explore a data set and to pick out representative or concerning examples. And perhaps that's even more compelling to a journalist in many cases, like a particularly egregious example of a behavior than, a statistic that something's, 5% more likely now. And it's not to say to rule out the statistics, but I would center the actual act of the data set curation and display as sort of a first-rate thing to build stats on top of.
Yeah. Both April and Jack, you've talked about the people who build the algorithms, and Tim, you as well, with the culpability. One of the things that I've been struggling with a lot in terms of the critique of tech is the extent to which it takes tech at its word. That there is a story that goes, Google and Facebook used machine learning to build a mind control ray to sell you a fidget spinner, and then Robert Mercer stole it and made your uncle racist. And I think it's quite possible that there are people who work in ML who believe that their technology is that persuasive, but I am skeptical of that claim, not least because everyone who's ever claimed to have mind control was either kidding themselves or the rest of us. And extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof, and that can't just be Facebook did that one study where they showed a get out the vote message to 20 million people and saw an effect size of 0.4%. That's not an existential threat to human free will, right? So I wonder how we deal with the claims of evil geniusness on the part of both tech and its critics, and whether it's not giving tech too much credit rather, to admit that they are geniuses, even if we condemn them for being evil in the same breath.
I imagine Tim has a lot to say about this subject.
I think not hugely. I think it's a really good question. I mean, we live in this age of kind of this grift capitalism, this startup grift capitalism of it's, Elizabeth Holmes or Elon Musk, or asteroid mining is the new thing. This idea that you can just create capital and investment through outrageous claims, and clearly that is behind a lot of this. I mean, we're still, I've just picked up the Tim Hwang book. I've not had a chance to read it yet. It looks fantastic, about how we're entering this kind of attention deficit, this subprime attention deficit crisis, and how that's this massive implications of the internet, because we've built everything around advertising, which doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work because it didn't work in the late 90s either, right? You know, I lived through being made redundant every 6 months, working for .com companies and startups between 1997 and 2003, right? You know, and that was because advertising collapsed. It's because, and then it was because 9/11 meant advertising collapsed. You know, it was like there was always something, and I think we're still going for that cycle. How the mind control Ray thing, it's fascinating, right? Because there's some. It does work on some people. I'm convinced it works on some people in the right circumstances, but that doesn't make it the answer that we're necessarily trying to target, right? I saw, just before getting on the call today, I saw fantastic, dismaying bit of reporting, I think it was in the New York Times, saying that the vast majority of content that was being, disinformation content that was being shared on Facebook was in private groups. So you can't see it anyway, you can't track it. So it's impossible to keep a kind of a real idea about what's happening with this stuff. It's an interesting one because the tech companies have worked themselves into a situation where they want to both sell this to advertisers as a miracle technology, and whilst defending the fact that it doesn't, you know, defending the fact that it's dangerous. Either way, they've got to admit it doesn't fucking work at some point, right? And how you get them to do that is the tricky thing.
April, I can see you busting to get in there.
I just think it's hard to say that it doesn't work, honestly, because it's hard to know how propaganda works or spreads, right? Like you put a billboard out, you don't know how many people for sure read it or were slowly convinced if they saw enough billboards and enough people started talking about it in their family group chat, and people who they had different power relationships with that they thought they couldn't contest. I mean, we just don't know. You know, I think that often it may be overstated when it comes to like how people are able to be have their political opinions changed because of the media that they consume. But we have to, again, take a very, very holistic, well-rounded approach. And, you know, if it wasn't, let me go back. During the subprime mortgage crisis, for example, this example is coming to mind. When we looked at the digital ad buyers, right, 2006, 2007, 2008, in the top, I believe top 5, but at least the top 10, were all of the big subprime mortgage companies. They were buying a ton of ads online. And when we're looking at like who was most affected by the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, it was primarily Latino and Black families. And those families were, and when we go back to the trade journals and you know, different conversations that were being had at the time by subprime mortgage companies and digital marketers, were targeting people based on their geographic location that denoted race, targeting people essentially based on a constellation of things that would indicate what race they were. And they received more ads. And it's hard to ever draw a line. Is, you know, A to B to C, like, is this why it was affected more? Of course, the large answer is like, of course, not only that, but to say that it wasn't effective, then why did they continue to do it, right? If propaganda isn't effective, why is so much money invested in it, right? If we look at, for instance, I'm sure you're referring a bit to Cambridge Analytica and the Internet Research Agency. I mean, did the Internet Research Agency flip any voters? I don't know, probably, maybe not, maybe it did, who knows? But they sure did invest a lot of time in tactics that they had tested all over the world for many, many years in order to sow distrust and at least spark conversations that they wanted to spark, or at least like ignite political feelings and sentiments that they wanted to ignite. So, you know, I think it's very, very difficult to say, well, this is the effect on X, Y, or Z. Another thing that's coming to mind finally is the rule that was passed by Housing and Urban Development as to whether or not Facebook ads would be allowed to be targeted when it comes to buying a home or mortgaging a home or any sort of home financial product based on someone's race, right? Like they're not allowed to do that anymore because it's discriminatory. Did it actually affect in the real world redlining? Hard to say. These are very difficult lines to ever draw in hard terms, but we know what discrimination is. And we also know that if groups are investing in something, then over and over again, year after year, then we have to ask what's working.
Sure, so I think that's, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I was going to say, I think the investment framing is a great one, and to maybe throw a little bit of cold water on the idea that the evil genius perspective, the process that I tended to observe, within a few years working at Google and working with people in like YouTube, was that you'll have research groups that will propose these projects that are where the entire purpose is increase site-wide watch time by, I don't know, a fraction of a percent would be considered a huge victory. And you come up with a model and you build this really complicated system. So for example, one of the ones I worked on, which not so much a fan in hindsight, was trying to identify, quote, gateway videos, which if you could build clusters of videos, like maybe jazz music, was there a particular jazz song which when someone listened to it, they now start listening to jazz? So that you could like come up with a cluster and do the kind of hook to get someone to start exploring that category of content. Anyway, so you come up with the theory, which is, okay, well, if I can identify, say, these gateway videos, and then I throw a few of them into the recommendation system, then that should increase site-wide view time because I kind of increased someone's knowledge. And the theory might have been, well, people just get bored of watching the same stuff and they tune out. So if you increase someone's kind of taste, then they watch more. Okay, so you build this system, you deploy, or you get it running, and then you run it through an A/B test. And most of the time it doesn't work. And that's not to say that the ones that make it through the A/B test don't have an impact. It's just that the sort of the hypothesis often doesn't hold, not necessarily because it wasn't true, but because these systems are kind of hodgepodge. So there might be 5 other groups that made changes. It could have been that you ran your A/B test for like a week and you needed to have ran it for 6 months before the impact would have come in. So anyway, the kind of perspective I would give is that you have absurd amounts of money and extremely highly trained people thinking very deeply about how to manipulate behavior. And still most of the time it doesn't work, but there's a gate which makes it so that the ones that do make it through should have an impact in the long run. So is that evil genius? I mean, maybe I would put the historical context of how people thought about, I think it was in the 90s when psychologists started being hired to figure out how to get TV commercials to get kids to nag their parents more.
80s, Reagan.
80s. So I would assume the kind of general repulsion to that is the degree of resources being directed at trying to manipulate the behavior of children. And to be clear, these systems are doing that exact same thing now. So I think from that perspective, my concern is just as much intrinsically on the resources dedicated to manipulating the behavior as it is necessarily the impact of the thing.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
No, just to jump in with the advertising thing, the thing that reminds me of what you were saying, Jake, is that kind of Viagra spam emails in the late 90s when we were just, you'd open your email inbox up with your spam email. It was just constant Viagra spam. And everyone would laugh about it and be like, well, why are they bothering doing this? It isn't working. It turns out like 0.2% of people clicked through and bought Viagra. And that was enough. And if you can do it on a big enough scale, then it becomes a return of investment calculation, right? At the end of the day, it's like, if we can automate spamming people or targeting them in certain ways, if you test that tiny thing, like you were saying, Jack, about the tiny increase of view time on the page is seen as a huge victory for someone. You can't get out of that kind of philosophy, which is what's got us stuck here.
A small effect size times a large sample set can add up. I'm always skeptical of the claim that if people are buying a lot of something, it must work. And the place where my kind of moment of satori there was when I learned that that there were virtually no hedge fund managers who outperformed the S&P 500. And so the richest people on earth, who were the most sophisticated investors on earth, were giving trillions of dollars a year to people who underperformed a Vanguard index fund. to get less money from them. And at that point I was like, yeah, you know, this is more like, you know, even people in adjacent disciplines don't really understand it. You know, Thomas Watson knew an awful lot about the helical structure of the DNA molecule, but he's a eugenicist who, you know, consistently loses arguments with computational genomists who are like, you just have no idea what you're talking about. Nobel Prize or not, you're an idiot when it comes to genomics, right? So it seems like the fact that people buy ad tech doesn't necessarily mean it works. I mean, Wanamaker told us that half my ad spending is wasted, but I don't know which half. And for me, the moral of that story was always that the ad men who were selling to Wanamaker were really good at selling to Wanamaker because he thought that only half his ad spending was wasted. And, you know, historically, the ad industry has been really good at selling the ad industry, if not the things the ad industry sells. I wanted to, sorry, go ahead, April.
That's totally, oh, just on that, that's totally true. And I absolutely agree. So, you know, pulling back from my statements around buying, you know, this ad tech being bought, what these companies are really selling is attention, right? And Jack was getting at that. And so what they're good at producing is boredom on the case of the user. And what they're good at selling then is that attention that that can then satiate the boredom that they've perhaps produced. So, you know, hard to say what's effective and not when you're in that type of relational dynamic. And you know, and it's ultimately the user that's being affected and being sold. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
And the thing I would add on to the, just because it's being bought doesn't mean it's effective. There was this program I used to participate in where I'd have lunch with a random person every few days, and I happened to work out of a sales office. So I got to know a lot of ad sales employees, and you learned an interesting pattern, which is how it is that the sale actually works, which is often an implicit enticement that if you sell enough of this type of ad, whether it's Facebook or Google, you will then get hired into Facebook or Google later because you're now an expert in the technology. And so I started realizing, wait a second. And then they'd explain that, you know, people that actually knew how to do these ad sales wouldn't last very long. And so almost always you're dealing with people that don't know what they're doing. And so you start to view it as more of like a game where you're effectively implicitly bribing companies to spend on your technology, because the employee that makes the decision then gets a financial benefit later from the sale. And that this seems a bit like an unsustainable kind of pyramid scheme where the people are going to keep coming into Google, and you'll need these companies to keep growing and growing to maintain this kind of social pressure for the sales cycle. And, you know, maybe I'm reading a bit too much into it, but you know, I talked to some of the salespeople and they'd say, you're not that wrong, actually, with the way you do the sales cycle. So again, like, you know, maybe you just need an excuse to justify more than you actually needed the gain.
So in our back and forth before we did this panel, one of the things that came up was the way that technical terminology can produce more heat than light and can serve to baffle rather than illuminate when used by industry, particularly in talking to journalists and regulators, but also it can form a barrier in talking to the people who are affected by it that journalists address. But there are some irreducible complexities. And so what I wanted was for you folks to either tell me which things you think people can safely ignore, that it's just BS, or which things that when they hear the term, or which terms are worth digging into, familiarizing yourself with, and that are in fact, you know, core to the question of how machine learning, bias, algorithms, and classifiers and decision support work in the real world for where it affects real people.
That's a huge question. I would maybe bite it by saying always start with exploring the underlying data set and perhaps trying to understand who it is that was paid or volunteered to generate the thing, and try and think of what their motivations might have been. And then further, you know, if you want to dig in a bit on the more of the math and statistics side, I think regression and logistic regression are achievable conceptual goals, even at like, I want to say late high school, early college, if that's something you target. I don't think it's a lot of the time people start talking about deep networks, I think far too soon, when if you talked about logistic regression and, you know, just sum of squares regression first, you can get really far in understanding a lot of concepts.
April or Tim? I know it's an odd one.
It's one I needed to do some prep for, I think. I think
I mean, is there a term that you hear and you're just like, ugh, I know that this person is just talking out of their butts, or?
I'm trying to think. I agree hugely with Jake. I'm sorry, Jack. Sorry, I'm getting everybody confused. I agree hugely with Jack in that I think the thing not to ignore is data sets and all this. I think that's the thing that we need to, and I find that's often the hardest concept to get through to people. People don't always understand that because it's quite often dealing with things that are literally on a scale that people can't comprehend a lot of the time. It's a tough one. I think the way I push back on stuff, and it's perhaps naive of me to do this in some ways, but when I'm having discussions, especially with students and readers and people, it's like, do we need this to be machine learning technology? Are we applying this technology in places where it's needed to be applied? The thing it's doing for you now, was it doing it for you 5 years ago, and has that really improved your life in any way? Is it? I mean, okay, it's easy to tap a screen and a cab to come. You know, was it not easier 5 years ago to have the phone number for a cab company in your phone that you just pulled up and you tapped that? And you said, can I have a cab, please? You know, and that's kind of, we've been like seduced by the convenience a lot of the time, which is the other discussion I think, which is very, very important in this, that we need to be having with people. But just a general, have we been sold this technology, but for ways we just don't need it? And can we see a future where we look back on this stuff as a failed experiment in some ways, right? Can we look back at this without just assuming this technology is coming and accepting it and let it steamroll us? Is there a way we could look, hey, look, we tried it didn't work out. Let's have a moratorium on using it for certain things, especially stuff which involve human communication and cultural reproduction and news and media and stuff. So, yeah, I think that's just a general kind of, it's the conversation I try and have with people. It's like, do we need to be doing this at all?
You know, I feel like I picked. Yeah, I stayed quiet until I got to pick the straw I want here. So sorry, I was just thinking through it. But you know, I don't know if there's like a piece of vocabulary where if I heard it, I would immediately be like, this is just gibberish, and you need to really break down what you're talking about, because it's all gibberish and we all need to break down what we're talking about, and that's really our jobs as writers, and not just journalists, but we're also writers, right? We're also explaining things and unpacking things and you know, like as I said before, assuming the competence of our readers and making sure that we do the work so that they can understand it, and also do the crunch the numbers and the research in a way so that, you know, we can talk about very specific harms, and not so general. So when we're talking about data breaches or data that goes into an AI set, or you know, a piece of tech used by a police department, you know, we really need to ask, how is it being used? Who's being hurt? We really need to do the narrative work, because when we report on the tech without reporting on the people, most people aren't going to care, because it's like hundreds of, you know, another, like these headlines write themselves, 500 million people's data were exposed in this breach, or, you know, it's just like, well, was I part of that? I don't know. I guess I'll find out if my bank account is messed up later, or I won't, you know. You have no idea. And so I think it's just the narrative component in all of this. You know, we have to explain the technical expertise, and on that, it reminds me of something that actually didn't have a strong narrative component, but a story that I worked on with Jack using a data set that he had compiled around contracts that technology companies have with the military and other federal agencies, in order to really get the narrative of this amazing data correct that Jack had been able to derive. I had to actually go back to Jack multiple times and been like, hey, actually, can you take these agencies out? Can you isolate the cloud contracts here? because we wanted to be sure, we didn't want to just say a big bucket and say, you know, military and federal agencies. I wanted to be able to just like say just the military, or be able to say, you know, well, these cloud contracts are separate, or this had to do with Microsoft Word, you know, and really dive into the data in really much more precise and grueling ways in order to make sure that we had a narrative that was precise and correct enough to show the power dynamics that we were trying to illustrate. But that required being very, very precise with who we were talking about when we were talking about who had these contracts. And it was more precise than Jack, I think, as we were reporting, than you had originally presented in your report. I kept going back and saying, hey, can you isolate this list and this list and this list? And so thank you for helping me dig through that. But it was that precision really allowed us to get to a narrative.
Yeah, you never know which part of a report someone is going to find most interesting. So it could be that something was kind of a supporting argument as opposed to your thesis. And so there's a certain amount of care that you put in something when it's your thesis as opposed to it's your, you know, like the language has to be much more careful to not be misinterpreted. And that was the thing that I think was a surprise there. But April, bringing up federal contracting, I think is a really good example for why we shouldn't just always jump to statistics, which is that even the very notion of the monetary value of a contract is an extraordinarily difficult conversation that is almost always done wrong. And the perfect example of it is the JEDI Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure sequence of contracts, which, you know, the original kind of cap on it was $10 billion, but they didn't list what the sort of expected.
And that's a Pentagon contract that was contested between Microsoft and Amazon, just to clarify.
Yeah, exactly. But it brings up this, and you'll see this all the time with, you know, even Anduril recently, I think, promoted a 250 million, I forget the exact number with a contract, but the thing is that was like the ceiling of the award, and they'll be competing against, you know, 10 other, I forget how many companies for every component of it. And so just the very notion of even assigning a single numeric value to something is often really iffy, and you need a huge amount of context before you can do it. So now imagine adding statistics on top of that. Like if we can't even say one value with confidence, how can we expect to not kind of mislead people with statistics? So yeah, I don't necessarily have a conclusion from that, other than I think sometimes we're just not willing to go to the level of detail that is needed to properly discuss things.
Yeah, I want to brief for detail here as well. For me, the alarm bells go off whenever I hear someone talking about the automation employment crisis, and specifically as it relates to trucking, which is just this incredible series of misapprehensions where the Bureau of Labor Statistics numeric code for trucker involves anyone who operates a heavy goods vehicle of any description. And that makes it, you know, the most popular job in many states. But that's like UPS drivers and also 16-wheeler drivers. And if you have a milkman, it's the milk float, right? It's like any HGV, moving trucks, all of it. And then they say, well, and as we can all see, you can automate a 16-wheeler. It's like, okay, maybe, right? You could give it its own lane and and keep other vehicles out of it and make sure they're all automated. You've just invented a shitty train. That's good. Okay. And then they say, so we are about to put the most popular job in 18 states out of business with our automation. It's like, no, you've speculated that we could make bad trains and that this would affect an unquantifiable chunk of you know, this overly vague or broad Bureau of Labor Statistics numeric code. It's like those Dewey Decimal codes that point out the problems with Melvin Dewey's imagination, where it's like Christianity has got like 75 digits to it, and then like other religions have got like 1 decimal point at the end, you know. Anyway, that's my example. We are basically at time here, and I wondered if you folks had closing remarks, ways to find you online, things you want to plug that have come out recently, or that you think people should follow up on, that sort of thing. No,
I mean,
go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
That's sorry. Everyone's just too polite, man. just thanks very much for having me, Cory. This has been great. Thanks to CIJ for inviting me along. If people want to find me, I'm usually chatting some shit on Twitter at Tim Maughan, all one word. Tim Maughan Books. You can find my stuff. My novel Infinite Detail touches on a lot of this stuff. Came out last year. I have a column starting for 10 probably this month about complexity and how that impacts a lot of the stuff we're kind of talking about at the moment. So yeah, people can find me if they can put up with the huge noise to signal ratio that comes with me, I'll be honest.
And I'll say I'm at April Laser, APRALASER on Twitter, as well as my contact information is there. People should leak to me like a sieve. I have Signal and email address, and I report on all kinds of things from not just algorithms and harms as a result of software, but also the workplace cultures that go into building that, and as well as worker organizing that has become very, very prominent lever of power that's been pulled in recent years in really fascinating and effective ways within the technology industry. And I also just want to say, I'm so happy you ended on my biggest pet peeve, Cory, which is that article from 2015 from NPR about the automated trucker, or like about the trucking industry being so prominent according to BLS data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and how that all these jobs were going to be at risk because of the forthcoming automation of trucking. That was an example where the data wasn't read correctly. It's not the most prominent job in America. Administrative work is, and healthcare workers come but even before truck drivers as well. And nor do we have robot trucks on the road anytime soon. So I thought I was really happy you ended with that, because that's totally something I forgot about in terms of kind of the crowning problem, or like a great example of how we can report on this in problematic ways that can scare people.
Yeah, when you hear robot truck, think bad train. Jack.
Right.
So I can be found at _Jack_Poulson on Twitter, and I would say I would point to a report that I released a few weeks ago that was trying to tackle a few things at once. One, showing the impacts of Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on the effective tax rates of the tech companies, defense contractors, and consulting companies, as well as showing how you can source Securities and Exchange Commission filings to show how these different companies see each other as peers, and then get a sense of how large they are relative to each other. I think most people really have pretty miscalculated sense of size, for example, between like Lockheed Martin and Accenture and the tech companies. Like the major defense contractors are actually not all that big relative to the, the major tech companies. It's kind of frightening when you look at the difference in size. So yeah, I think taxes are always hard to get people to care about, but I think it's extraordinarily important, given that there was a statement from Biden that he would repeal the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, I would say what we need to do is re-raise the federal statutory rate and actually close the offshore loopholes, as opposed to necessarily repealing this thing. But anyway, that's a different discussion.
Yeah. Preach. Well, I'll close it out then and thank CIJ for the opportunity to talk. You can follow my work at pluralistic.net. That is also distributed as a Twitter feed and a Mastodon feed and a newsletter. It's all surveillance free. It costs nothing. And it's all black type on white backgrounds for people with bad low vision like me. And then to plug, I have a new book out, the Third Little Brother book, Attack Surface, as endorsed by Edward Snowden, is just out. And also out this year was my first ever picture book, Posey the Monster Slayer. So that's what I got to say. Thank you to CIJ. Thank you to my co-panelists. Thank you to all of you who've tuned in today. And Excelsior.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, stay safe.